more people might still wander in, but we need to get started because the reception is going to take place in front of this building at 6:20. Thank you all for coming to this session, the title of which is Burma/Myanmar's Transition, Prospects for Peace and National Reconciliation. Our speaker for this session is Alex James, who is the Research and Advocacy Officer of Burma Partnership, which is a network of organizations mobilizing for democracy and human rights in Burma, and their main office is based in Masot, right on the Thai-Burma border. Alex has been monitoring and conducting research on the peace process between the Central Burmese government and many ethnic armed groups for the past 2 years, and is going to share his insight with us on the ongoing peace process and the process of ceasefire negotiations. But before we turn it over to Alex, we're going to watch a approximately 15-minute campaign film that was produced by Burma Partnership called Guns, Briefcases, and Inequality, the Neglected War in Kachin State. And this film demonstrates the need for the government of Burma to engage in meaningful political dialogue with all ethnic nationalities on equal ground in order to address the underlying causes of the armed conflict that has been disturbing peace and tranquility in Burma for many, many decades. The main issues of which are the ethnic nationalities' aspirations for self-determination, the lack of ethnic rights, and inequality in the country. So the format for this session is going to be, first of all, we will watch the film, which is about 15 minutes, and then Alex is going to present for about 20 or 25 minutes, and following that we'll have time for some questions and discussion. Thank you.
Hi, so my name's Alex. I work for Burma Partnership. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'll give you a bit of context with that film. That was shot last year, middle of 2013. And the situation hasn't really changed much. The peace talks are ongoing, but there's been no solution as of yet. Conflict is ongoing. Just last week, this week, sorry, there was heavy fighting about an hour outside of Liza, and that's the KIO stronghold. And human rights violations are persisting in Kachin areas, northern Chiang state, where there's also fighting. So I'm going to give a short presentation on the conflict, more generally about the conflict, a bit of context, and the situation not just in Kachin areas but also ceasefire areas, particularly Karen state. So I'm going to give an extremely short historical context, because I'm pretty sure that you're quite aware, but Panglong Agreement, which was referred to in the film, that was 1947. That was an agreement between General Aung San, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's father, and 3 of the main ethnic groups, the Chin, the Shan, and the Kachin. And this is an agreement which granted substantial autonomy and actually the right to succession to the Shans after 10 years. And this is an agreement which was ripped up shortly after Aung San was assassinated. But this is something, it's a reference point, the Panglong Agreement. It's a reference point to the aspirations of ethnic nationalities being realised. And so this is something that always comes up in the messaging and what the ethnic nationalities want. So not long after this was ripped up, the country imploded into civil war. Not just ethnic based, but there was the biggest threat to the Burma army was the Communist Party of Burma, which held large amounts of territory, particularly northern Burma. And at this point, at the start of the conflict, the Burma army was actually small, under-equipped, and nearly lost Rangoon to the KNU. But as military dictatorships, the expansion of the Tatmadaw, the Burma army, the Four Cuts policy in the 1970s, then a lot of the territory that the Communist Party of Burma, as well as the ethnic armies held, that slowly started to decrease, particularly in the 1990s. And so now there's a lot less territory administrated by the ethnic armed groups. The late 80s saw the dissolution of the Communist Party of Burma. That's dissolved, and some new ethnically based armed groups came out of that, in particular the WA. And I'll come back to them later, but the WA are traditionally, they don't have the same explicit political aspirations as the other ethnic armed groups. And they have been essentially an opium producing organisation, but a very well armed one. The 1990s saw ceasefire agreements with most of the ethnic armed groups, not the KNU, but also in 1994 the Kachin, the KIO, had an agreement which was 1994, and that lasted 17 years till the outbreak of fighting that we saw in the film in 2011. A lot of these ceasefires were declared null and void after the government tried to get all the ethnic armed groups to come under the wing of the Burma Army as border guard forces, and so a lot of these ceasefires broke down. And so we'll get to the current context. President Singh comes to power. We start to see the beginnings of a transition to democracy in Burma, and there have been certain positive things which have happened, as we've seen. Aung San Suu Kyi released from house arrest and is now in the parliament after winning a by-election. A lot of political prisoners released, although still some remain. Some opening up of the media, and also ceasefires signed with all but the KIO and the TNLA. So the KIO, which we've seen in the film, and the TNLA, which is a slightly smaller ethnic group, the Ta'ang, and they're based in northern Chiang state, and they're also currently engaged in conflict with the Burma army. We've also seen a lot of the ethnic groups coming together, a lot more solidarity than we have seen in previous years. There have been attempts in the past, but I think now we're seeing more than before. But they're still questionable. There's still intra conflicts between, not armed conflicts, but disagreements between those other armed groups. And so now what we're seeing that President Thein Sein and the government negotiation team, they're working towards a nationwide ceasefire, which is, he wants to be a very public and a very grand ceremony in Naypyidaw, the capital, where all the ethnic armed groups will sign this nationwide ceasefire with UN observers and to say, we've done it, we've got peace. The reality is obviously a lot more complicated, and we'll get into that in a second. A couple of little caveats is the title of this talk is Prospects for Peace and National Reconciliation, and I'm going to concentrate on the ethnic armed groups, but I think it's important when we're talking about national reconciliation to mention about the recent religious violence in Rakhine State against the Rohingya, which is turning the country upside down. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. And I think this is another caveat to national reconciliation. But I'm not going to concentrate on that because I'm just concentrating on the armed violence. But yeah, just a quick note, there's still 100,000 armed soldiers, insurgent or rebel soldiers in Burma, and about 500,000 Tatmadaw Burma army. So, the first thing I want to say about the peace process so far, since the ceasefire negotiations began about 3 years ago, is that there has been progress and ceasefires have been signed, and this is a real opportunity, unprecedented since the start of Burma's civil wars. There's a real opportunity here to garner peace, to actually get sustainable peace. But there are still problems. There's still problems ongoing. The situation in the conflict areas, I think the film demonstrated what's going on in KIO, Kachin Independence Organization territory. Ongoing conflict is happening daily. The helicopter warships, airstrikes have been used. 2011 and 2012, the Burma Army massively increased the amount of arms imports, mainly from China and Russia. So there is still this ongoing conflict, and also with the Chiang National Liberation Army. This has obviously had a huge effect on the civilian population. There's about 100,000 people, internally displaced people from the Kachin conflict, and they've had little access to humanitarian aid. For about 18 months, President Thein Sein blocked humanitarian aid to the people who were in the IDPs in the KIO-held territory. These days there are some UN convoys getting there, but not nearly enough. So the situation in the IDP camps is pretty dire. And human rights violations directly related to the conflict are continuing, as was highlighted. Rape and sexual assault, torture, arbitrary arrest, extrajudicial killings, forced labour. These are pervasive and ongoing and done with impunity. And there's an increase in Burma Army battalions in those areas. Like the Taang, I was speaking to some Taang people last week, and the amount of Burma Army battalions in their area doubled between 2012 and 2013, went from 16 to 32. Yeah, the conflict's ongoing, it's as simple as that. Just a few days ago, I think you might have seen in the news, heavy fighting an hour outside Liza. But then there's the ceasefire areas, which is a lot of parts of the country, the Karen, the Chin, the Mon, the Shan areas. There's still occasional clashes in the Karen areas and the Mon areas. In the Shan areas there are regular clashes despite the ceasefire agreements. An important thing to note about the ceasefire agreements is that they are very preliminary and there's no code of conduct yet. So the KNU proposed a military code of conduct, so how the two armies would behave so to avoid further clashes. This code of conduct has been rejected. The Shan State Army South made overtures to the local commanders on the ground to say, look, we'll inform you, let's get something going here because we've clashed over 100 times this year, but that was rejected by the Burma military top brass. So there's still ongoing clashes despite the ceasefire agreements, the preliminary ceasefire agreements. Related to human rights violations, and this is information based from Karen areas, there's 4 main points in the ceasefire areas, particularly in the Karen state. There is a reduction in the directly conflict-related abuses. There is a reduction. They're ongoing, but there's a reduction, so there is less, extrajudicial killing, forced labour, torture. Secondly, militarization. The Burma Army are using this ceasefire period to restock, resupply, rearm the bases in the ceasefire areas. There's a great quote here from a Karen woman I spoke to, and she said, before the Burma Army bases they were made of bamboo, but now they're made of concrete. And so this is exacerbating the trust deficit between ethnic communities and the central Burma government, the central Burma Army. Thirdly, related to development projects, huge amount of land confiscation. Development projects, a lot of mining projects, plantations, big special economic zones, logging. There's a massive increase in this. Local business, national business and international businesses have been taking advantage of the lull in the conflict, and they're going in and they're making local deals with crony businessmen, with perhaps local armed actors, and people's land is being taken off of them. And fourthly, I think this is especially related to Karen State, is the border guard forces, which come under the control of the Burma Army. They're heavily involved in the production and sale of drugs. yaba, methamphetamine. So this is having a big social effect on Karen communities especially. Prospects for peace, part of the title. As I said before, I think, in my opinion, studying the history books, this is unprecedented. You've got more inter-ethnic cooperation, you've got a dedicated government body working towards peace, which is called the Myanmar Peace Centre. You've also got international support. Norway has been heavily involved. They supported something called the Myanmar Peace Support Initiative. Japan with the Nippon Foundation. There's a peace donor support group which the World Bank, Norway, Australia and the UK among others are giving funds to support the peace process. So you do have the international support, you do have elements within the government reaching out to the armed groups and making the right noises, and you do have the ethnic groups working together. The issue is that this is in its early stages. The real structural issues as to why there isn't peace, they haven't been addressed yet. Natural resource management, as we saw in the film, a lot of the human rights violations and the conflict is related to development projects, the Shui gas and oil pipeline, mining projects, and so the sharing of the natural resources, which is the ethnic areas are very, very rich in. This hasn't been addressed. Power sharing, so autonomy for the ethnic areas. The role of the military is still entrenched in the constitution, and ethnic rights have not been guaranteed. So we're at a great stage in history, I think, but the real issues haven't been addressed just yet. And I'll give an example where there's a disconnect between what the government is saying and what the Burma army is saying. This was just the other day, President Thein Sein in an address said, all national races are to establish the national unity based on the Panglong spirit and then march towards a peaceful, modern and democratic nation through a federal system. So I think the two key points there, Panglong spirit is evocative of power sharing, of a time when the ethnic groups and the central Burmans had an agreement which suited the ethnic nationalities' aspirations. So him using that is very evocative. And secondly, federal system, which is something that the ethnic groups have been calling for decades. And so this is exactly the right things to say. But then, a few weeks ago, a quote from Des Min Aung Hlaing, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the number one of the army. And he said, we made peace agreements, but that doesn't mean we are afraid to fight. We are afraid of no one. There is no insurgent group we cannot fight or dare not to fight. And I think the contrast is quite striking. The Burma army are not on board on the peace process yet. So you do have this government body engaged in ceasefire negotiations, peace negotiations, but there isn't a buy-in from the Burma army yet. Those words contrast so much. In the actual peace talks themselves, regional commanders who should be present because they have control of the Burma army on the ground are not present. And the Burma army continues what it wants to do anyway, and then it keeps on its offensives, especially in Kachin State, as we saw. Late 2011, early 2012, a few months into the Kachin conflict, President Thein Sein ordered the end all offensives in Burma, and then a week later, the Burma army continued its offensives. So there is this real disconnect. There's no buy-in from the Burma army yet. And I think this is a key obstacle to the peace process so far. Another major stumbling block is the constitution. A lot of fuss has been made, fuss is the wrong word, a lot of attention has been on the clause that disallows Aung San Suu Kyi from running, and that's obviously a flaw. But for ethnic people, which make up about 40% of the population of Burma, the constitution centralizes central power. The ethnic states have very little autonomy and power to make decisions. There's a slight actually a slight improvement. Just a few days ago, the Constitution Review Committee, they came out with some recommendations where the local assemblies can elect their own leader, as opposed to currently it's the President Thein Sein who nominates the leader of the local assembly. But it's still, it only goes so far, these recommendations. The Constitution, it entrenches military power and it entrenches central control over the ethnic nationality regions. So this is a big stumbling block. The Constitution needs to be amended if we're going to, these prospects for peace are going to get better. Another problem, I alluded to more cooperation between the ethnic groups, but there's also disagreements there, both within armed groups and between armed groups. There's a point about late 2012, early 2013 where the KNU nearly split. There's different factions within the groups who are pulling different ways about how to go about the peace process. Secondly, inter-ethnic cooperation is good, but there's still arguments and there's still different bodies. You've got the UNFC, the United Nationalities Federal Council, you've also got the Working Group for Ethnic Coordination, and they consist of many of the same members, but they're led by different people and they don't have the same, sometimes, strategies as to what they want to do. And there's also a KNU and Chiang State Army South separate thing where they put out a joint statement together which perhaps contrasted with the UNFC. And at the moment with the peace negotiations, they still can't agree on the nationwide ceasefire. So those talks keep being delayed because they can't quite agree on it. So yeah, I think this is also an obstacle to the peace process. Another big issue which doesn't get that much media attention, the biggest well-armed, well-equipped armed group, the WA, and there's been rumours and reports that China has actually been selling them helicopters and training them to fly these helicopters and provide them with military equipment. They're not really part of the discussions as of yet, and the huge, there's maybe 25 or 30,000 very well armed troops who, and there's been no progress. It's a big issue, but it's not really been touched yet. And they have slightly different political aspirations to the rest of the ethnic armed groups. They're predominantly a drug-producing entity, and the reason they've got troops is more to protect that. This needs to be addressed. So, ways forward. A political settlement needs to happen, including changing the constitution, amending it, or writing a new constitution. People have different ideas of what they want, but a change in the constitution needs to happen to give more power sharing to ethnic regions. And this is going to have to include natural resource management, because like I said, a lot of the natural resources that are in the ethnic regions, you've got your teak, you've got your minerals, hydropower. A third point is impunity. And it was touched on in the film, but the Burma Army acts with impunity, and this is enshrined in the constitution, another aspect of the constitution that needs to be changed. There is a Myanmar National Human Rights Commission, but it still isn't transparent. It doesn't abide by the Paris Principles, which is the international norms as to how National Human Rights Commissions should abide by. And the chairman actually said, we're not going to investigate cases which happened in conflict areas. So that's Kachin. So this isn't an effective body yet. It can be in the future, but this is something that needs to be worked upon. Civil society participation in the peace talks needs to happen. There's been very little civil society participation so far, and that includes gender mainstreaming, representation and participation of women's groups. Another point is refugees. I mean, there's 130,000 refugees on the Thai-Burma border in Thailand. There's about 400,000 IDPs within Burma. And this is a huge issue that's going to have to be looked upon as the peace process goes forward. Economic development of the ethnic areas, years of conflict have left them Poor, very poor. I mean, Burma's a poor country, the ethnic regions are poorer than central Burma, and that's a consequence of the conflict. The last point is the need to institutionalise any peace agreement so that the successive governments can then revoke those agreements. They need to be institutionalised. And I think that, I think that's going to be difficult. Another point I think related to impunity is the need for transitional justice. And I'm not quite sure what form would be best for Burma, but unless the people feel a sense of justice, then the grievances which they've harboured for so long from the human rights violations and the conflict they've seen, they're not going to go away. So transitional justice is another aspect which has to be addressed. So yeah, just to conclude, this is a real opportunity, but the hardest part is yet to come, and that's the political dialogue, a political settlement, and that includes some kind of federalism. And a point I would like to make is that there's a lot of talk about federalism. I've mentioned it many times. But there needs to be a discussion on what federalism actually is and what it means for Burma, and this needs to be part of the peace talks. And then that real substantive political dialogue towards national reconciliation. Okay, thank you very much. And I'm open to any questions, discussion points, clarifications. Ask away if you want to.
I'd like to ask specifically about the Midzone Dam and how that, you might have more information about where that stands and how it ties into all of this. If you can speak a bit about that.
Sure. The Midzone Dam is in the Kachin area. It's a huge dam, Chinese-backed, where China is it produce hydropower, of which 90% will go to China. And this was agreed with the former military regime. Now, construction halted in late 2010 or 2011 by order of the president, then saying due to local resistance it was going to cause huge environmental, social and cultural negative impacts. And there was a big civil society campaign against that. The president stopped this dam. Well, he ordered the stop to it, but whether or not that the end to the construction of this is permanent is another matter. At the moment it's suspended. Chinese workers are still in and around the area. The Chinese company itself is very confident it will go ahead, and President Thein Sein will be out of power in 1 year anyway. So it's halted. I think there's a good chance work will start again. But I think that's another example of natural resource extraction exacerbating the conflicts in the ethnic areas, because none of the Kachin people were going to see the benefits to this dam. It was going to be money from the Chinese into the pockets of the Burmans, and the actual resources go to China.
Just to clarify, the dam was suspended in September 2011, 3 months after the as you said, Thein Sein did announce that it was in the will of the people, but actually the conflict which erupted in the will of the Kachin state obviously did cause major